Coming up next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Our member host today is seated at the head table is Charlie Hales, City Commissioner. He will introduce and ask the first question of our speaker. Following Charlie's question, we will open the program to questions from members in the audience. Since the microphone that says 4 on it is the one that'll be in camera, please come to this microphone when you have a question that you have of the speaker. You may have one of Charlie too, I don't know, but we'll focus on the speaker first. So with that, let me introduce Charlie Hale, who will introduce our speaker. Charlie?
Thanks, Lloyd, and good afternoon, everyone. In recent years, there have been a number of books heralding the rebirth of American cities. I've bought a number of these books, and I've even found the time to read some of them. But at the very least, I always start by flipping through the index of such books to find out what's being said about Portland. Most of these books are, after all, replete with descriptions of the Portland story, and they've done much to further our reputation as the last best place in America. I bought our speaker's book a couple of weeks ago, and I did not find Portland in the index, even though I know he's very familiar with Portland. Seattle is there, San Francisco is there, Milwaukee and Pittsburgh were listed, but no Portland. I nearly regretted asking Ray Suarez to come to the City Club. But now that I've had the opportunity to read more than the index, I'm glad that Portland is not featured in the old neighborhood, what we lost in the great suburban migration. This book tells the story of how racial tension, easy money, and plain old thoughtlessness drained the life out of city neighborhoods and sent it packing to the suburbs. Fortunately, that has not been our experience here in Portland. But I do think we can learn from Ray Suarez's study of what has happened to American cities between 1966 and today. In particular, I'm impressed by Ray's message that it takes hope and simple neighborliness to make a good place. It's not just the physical conditions, it's the social conditions, the day-to-day sociability that sustains a neighborhood as much as infrastructure and the physical things that we spend much of our time here in Portland debating and talking about. Ray Suarez hosts National Public Radio's popular call-in news program, Talk of the Nation, where he amazes listeners with his seemingly endless breadth and depth of knowledge about current events and the issues of our time. I had the opportunity to meet Ray at a conference in Austin last year and hear him speak here in Portland. We talked about his book and about the discipline and sacrifice required to pursue such an endeavor. He's had to miss a lot of weekends with his kids in order to get this book written. I'm sure that all of us who give our time to a cause of making a better world or a better community can sympathize. So once again, Ray left his home and kids in Washington, D.C. to be here with us today. So please, let's give a big City Club welcome to Ray Suarez.
Charlie, all I can say is I'll see what I can do for the paperback edition. When I was here last November, people asked if I would be coming back. And I told them that I was sure I would be, because once you immerse yourself in the business of writing about or talking about the fate of the American city, there's no way that you can stay out of Portland very long. You may keep it out of your index, but you can't keep it off your travel itinerary. And things are, in the main, in pretty good shape here. The things I can talk about here are different from those I'll be talking about with city planners in Cleveland in the fall when I attend the American Planning Association Ohio chapter meeting. You've tried to come to an accommodation with the automobile instead of letting it win every argument. You have, through the use of your growth boundary, taken the tremendous motive power of capital and investment and turned it toward the core, rather than letting that energy disperse like air from a balloon. You've grasped some of the toughest nettles of modern municipal self-governance, and with the help of things you couldn't control, a decent climate, regional employment growth, and escalating prices elsewhere in the region, like California, you've continued to attract new residents and brought in people who are making an affirmative choice to live here and live this way. People who want limitless point-to-point personal transportation, who want suburban-style land use patterns in the heart of the city, who want the local municipality to subsidize their fantasy of living in the country by helping them have enough roads that'll make them forget that it's not the country once they live there. People who want all those things don't move here. So you've got that working in your favor. If you want to live that kind of life, really, it's easy to get a long list of suggestions on where to go. Las Vegas, Phoenix, San Jose, Sacramento. And Las Vegas, I mean, if you get into some very, very complex trouble with the law, you could even talk to the mayor. So, you know, there are other places to go if that's what you're looking for. You haven't forgotten that close-in nature is a resource that can spur economic development rather than an impediment to be paved over and covered in 3,000 square foot McMansions. You haven't forgotten that people like dense, inviting spaces, and that they too are a spur to continued economic development. You know, I keep hearing that one of the reasons we're getting constantly more and more dispersal is because people like it that way. And then I look at the places people really want to be when they have spare time, when they're away from work, when they want to be out with the family. Where do they go? They go to places like Old Town Alexandria, or the Mall in Washington, D.C., or Times Square, or Faneuil Hall, or the Loop. They don't go out to their own driveways. That tells me something. Okay, so enough blowing smoke up your nose. Yes, by all means, give yourselves a big pat on the back. You'll enter the next century in good shape to take full advantage of the trends now shaping the American city. The hard part, the really hard part, is already underway. Granted, it was hard to keep the promises contained in the Portland downtown plan, now more than 25 years old. Many other cities had agreed long ago in principle, like Chicago, for instance, to work toward creating a particular atmosphere in downtown. And, you know, Chicago is a tremendous counterexample because there, in that transportation-rich environment, with rivers running north-south and east-west through the downtown, with commuter rail hooking up with in-town rapid transit, and those rails meeting up with long-haul trains that crisscross the country, the big tunas of downtown could only make the most tepid step toward relieving the crush of cars swarming the Loop day after day. Subway service to some of the poorest areas of the city have been curtailed or halted. And recently, when heading from downtown to O'Hare to catch a 3:10 plane, I left my hotel in the Loop at 1:45, figuring that would be early enough. Well, with no accidents, I ran into the United Terminal like a maniac at 3 o'clock. We had crawled through the north side at 3 to 5 miles an hour for much of the trip. And incidentally, I somehow made the plane. When I was here last fall, Mayor Cohn mentioned that the city had basically grown out to the growth boundary, and that's no surprise. Now will be the time to see whether you really mean it. Because now land prices are rising, rents are rising, purchase prices for existing homes are rising. Will you finally start to build up rather than out? Because that's what cities in your position start to do. But we have a fetishistic love for the detached single-family home that we're going to have some sort of honest talk about, or else we're not building any more land. You're not going to pave over the river. Yeah, I know. You thought about it and you decided not to. There was probably one of those city club votes about that, too. People had to raise their cards. I thought the last vote of the Supreme Soviet was the last time I was going to see that. All those people. Let's take a look at Manhattan. Manhattan real estate is like a pressure cooker. The rental market is so overheated that across the rivers in northern New Jersey, Brooklyn and Queens, moribund neighborhoods are rising to meet the rent refugees and welcome them home. In Portland, you don't have a need for Brooklyn up the Willamette. But what the urban growth boundary does is make an island out of a place that would otherwise be spreading like a Rorschach blot across the landscape. It makes you as if you've got an ocean surrounding you. Yes, artificial scarcity does have immediately tangible economic effects. It means your corporation isn't going to build a sprawling, multi-acre, two-story corporate park swimming in a sea of parking spaces, or at least you're not going to do it very cheaply anymore. It means you're going to build up rather than out. It means that some of these downtown blocks that are still, remarkably, being used as flat, single-level asphalt parking lots will eventually go away. The land will become too valuable for an economic use that really is so far down the food chain. There's the complicating factor of your seismic codes, but lightly used existing buildings will begin to make more sense for higher density use. One thing this pattern of development need not do is force up the cost of living in some drastic way, or price lower income service workers out of your economy. And finally, some of you are saying, aha, now he's wrong. Now I know he's wrong. Because I know that there are workers who can't find affordable housing. That's because we're talking about them shopping in a supermarket where the thing that they're trying to buy isn't on the shelves. Those rising rents should bring new developers into the game by demonstrating sufficient demand to spur new construction. Landlords, for those of you who are landlords, this will come as no surprise, landlords want to make money. And if there's a market, they will likely move to satisfy it. I say likely rather than definitely because in some markets, even in the face of persistent year-on-year demand, the marketplace has not moved to meet that growing demand. In Cleveland, market research shows thousands of potential renters and buyers for downtown apartments. Yet the market, like the boys at a high school dance, stands on the edge and waits to see what everybody else is going to do. Well, if you build all huge multi-bedroom units, they won't all rent. That's true. If you build all luxury apartments, they won't all rent. That's true. Part of the downtown economy is a cornerstone notion that a downtown, a healthy downtown, brings together economic forces that work at all levels in the marketplace. It's not just a playground for wealthy people. So if you build a downtown housing sector that's like a theme park to just draw in the highest income renters or buyers, yeah, it's going to be a bust. It's not going to do those things that you want a rental market to do. But if you think of the rental market as mirroring the market as a whole, where some people eat at McDonald's and some people eat at the toniest steakhouse in town and at all the places in between, then you'll be able to do this in a way that's going to meet your long-term needs here in Portland. GM doesn't only make Cadillacs. They sell everything from Geo Metros to that massive new Cadillac SUV. Isn't that exciting? Cadillac has an SUV. I was really disappointed my escorts from the City Club didn't pick me up in one. But they do that because they want to capture a portion of every single market segment. Not building mixed-income rental housing will create even more demand to bust through that urban growth boundary and start intensively building in the lower-cost development areas in order to provide a place where entry-level workers can rent and buy. Otherwise, you'll just be mimicking what sprawled-out suburbs are already good at. That is, shaping development in such a way that the only way to move up is to move out. because you're living in a residential monoculture. All the houses alike, all the houses mining one particular rung on the income ladder. Why not show off your good work of the last generation? If so many people rave about your downtown, why won't they rent a 2-bedroom apartment in it and walk to work? I bet they would, if there were more of them to rent. A slightly tougher nut to crack might be those neighborhoods in town that have gentrified in recent years. People like the bike paths, they like the public transit, they like the rising equity in their own homes. What they don't like is that infill housing that's intruding on their well-nurtured Queen Anne domesticity. Townhouses? Not in my neighborhood. Obviously, I'm overstating the case a little bit to make a point, but it is a critical... That's just a little soft soap, so you'll buy my book. But it's a critical phase in making your plan work that people in the segments of the population most likely to vote stay in your corner on this one, unless they bring the whole thing down. They can bring disproportionate pressure to back off, disproportionate to their numbers, or they simply leave and go somewhere else. Political leadership, with its ears close to the ground, can make a huge difference in how much people feel consulted and brought along rather than told what to do, and hence how much they feel the future is being crafted with their consent. As I've been traveling around the country in the last few weeks, I've identified the current class of big city mayors as one of the best in history. And as someone who lived through Marion Barry's last term as mayor of Washington, I can tell you how much any city's efforts to get help and support from outside the city limits, on the county commission, in the State House, or on Capitol Hill, can be swamped by the judgments, fair or unfair, of just one person, the mayor. So let's recognize how much difference a chief executive can make. Right now, who's sitting in that office in city halls across the country is part of urban America's good news. The bad news is that this same remarkable class of mayors has less and less to work with in the way of an industrial base, a tax base, transportation networks, and private investment. Mayors still delight, and probably will always delight, in posing with vast plaster models that show a large swath of the city remade by development projects. It's one of the best ways to get on the cover of your local paper's metro section, is to stand with one of those models that have the little fuzzy trees and the people that walking on the model sidewalks. The difference now is that with much degraded corporate bases, a less interested federal government, and better organized community groups, getting that model into brick, mortar, and glass is a lot tougher. And actually, that could be a good thing. No longer being able to rebuild acres of downtown real estate with a wave of your mayoral wand forces the projects to be better designed, and their boosters to line up more and more diverse interests before they go ahead. Many of the cities I've visited in recent years are so desperate for economic activity that they aren't fussy about the difficult truth, that they come to negotiations already believing they don't have a good hand to play. So for now, the thinking goes, let's get people in here and spending money for as many hours as we can manage before they head home over the city line. But hungry cities acting as the court jester for suburban America will not solve the problems of Newark and Cleveland and Youngstown and Akron and St. Louis. A resident, in 1,000 little ways, spins off economic activity unmatched by the visitor who comes in to see your new IMAX theater, buys a t-shirt and a frozen yogurt, and then heads home. So far, I've been talking so much about cities as economic entities that I haven't given nearly enough attention to cities as social systems, so I'll do that now. One of the most popular motifs in today's press is that Americans are searching for community. I'm sure you've heard this till you're ready to gag. We are all apparently searching for meaning in our lives, in the hunt for something that we know is missing, even if we're not sure what it is. The assumptions aren't questioned very strenuously because they act as the framework for the story. So, no newspaper reporter is going to write 3,000 words on the search for community if there isn't one. So, you have to believe that there is one in order to keep writing about it. The journalists don't dig, it seems, to that second level of analysis that might expose uncomfortable truths about the places people live, the places where that dissatisfaction festers, where it seems so hard to find community. I maintain that the widespread American feeling of a loss of community comes from a tightly tied knot of variables. Changes in the economy forced changes in the home. Changes in the built environment were reflections of new ideas about status, family roles, and the creation of home as a sanctuary from the realities of making a living, not part of it. By saying that, I'm not saying we should all return to the Lower East Side and huddle around kitchen tables sewing flowers for ladies' hats. I mean, it might be character building to bring our children in on piecework, but obviously that's another time, another place, another set of economic realities. And I don't know how well I could teach my kids to make those nice, small, flat stitches that would go into the collars on men's coats. I don't want Mom to have to take in washing again. But we should recognize that utility, the home as a reflection of our real lives, rather than as a dreamscape that's hard to pay for, hard to maintain, and forces our kids to yearn to do the single most dangerous thing they can do: drive. Apparently, we all move to these places, we tell ourselves and others when they ask, for the children. And our children can't wait to get out of them. We keep getting the houses we ask for, the ones we think will convey ideas about our success, ones that we will sell when we want to pick up and move again. And yet, we find it very hard to admit that those places are not working for us. I mean, you want to make a suburbanite crazy, talk about the way these exurban development edge communities are being built. They will insist till the last dog dies that this is all in response to consumer demand. Well, I want to go into some developer's office and see the pile of letters he got from people saying, I want a house that doesn't face any other house. Dear developer, I want a house with a ceiling so that I need one of those 17-foot aluminum poles in order to change the lights. That's what I really, really want. Human beings are social beings, and 50 years, our last 50 years of history, did not reprogram 100,000 years of human history. And much of America's residential construction takes no account for that and puts too much pressure on the nuclear family to provide for all our emotional needs. In the old world, urban and rural, a world of much wider bonds of mutual aid and affection, marriage and children were not the only context for an individual. And divorce rates, perhaps circumstantially, perhaps coincidentally, were also a lot lower. There's a doctoral thesis in that for somebody. Please, feel free. So much stress on the nuclear family, a condition only present in the American life in the last generation or two, is an almost unnatural state when compared to how people saw their own lives and raised their own children for centuries. We've turned the home into a stage of unreal expectations, an unreal play of our domestic dramas. I would submit, and of course those of you who read my book will realize that I'm submitting, that the city is one place where we can address a lot of these unreal expectations. But we have, in too many places, simply discarded the city, pronouncing it a relic from another age of American life, too easily forgetting that they've been and will continue to be the great forge of American culture. Hundreds of thousands of families, millions of people have left the city for what they know, if you ask them, is going to be a better life. New people to know, new schools to attend. Offended as they were by busing, they moved to communities where there is no other way to get to school except by bus. Commutes lengthen. Houses get bigger and bigger, laid out further and further from each other, as if to say, sure, I'm searching for community, but I do want to be sure there's a DMZ of grass around the house. Or I'm searching for community, but I want my house so far away from everything else that I'll need a telescope to do it. Today we are living with that world and flailing around because we're just not sure what to do next. Soybeans and corn grow in that virgin territory just beyond the last sewer hookup for a new subdivision, and we still manage to kid ourselves that maybe the answer to our problems lies right over there, just past where I can see on the horizon. So we didn't live as solitary beings on the savannas of Africa, in the caves of Europe, in the jungles of South America. All that's changed in countless centuries of human history is how big we've decided our groupings are. The size of the group, for a long time, responded to food supply, water supply, the nature of day-to-day life. So what are we today? Self-sufficient? Able to live totally independent of the group? The yearning for community that we're hearing so much about, reading so much about, says a lot. It says that people believe that we had it once, in various forms, in farm and factory, in school and church and sewing circle, and Masonic lodge and bowling league and softball league, block and park, ethnic group and language. It wasn't a big deal. It was just what life was. A way to live that was closer, denser, more interconnected, sometimes in a way that made you crazy instead of making you comforted, but that's part of the truth of that too. You ever see people look at you through fingers in a Venetian blind? Maybe that's something that's going the way of the horse and cart too. But there's a certain Venetian blind look that you can only get in a neighborhood of certain density. All right, so we don't miss that. But there is plenty that in order to get away from that, we threw away without thinking about what we would lose. We've emphasized individualism and personal rights to such an extreme extent that they have become the new civic religion. Individualism is fine, and that bootstrapping, paddle-your-own-canoe attitudes of Americans has helped make us rich. It's given us, the broad mass of Americans, a style of life unimaginable 50 or 60 years ago. But what we gained through that individualism, once more in proportion to our lives, has been balanced by what we're losing through it and continue to lose. Once upon a time, see, how many of you read To Renew America by Newt Gingrich? Oh. All right. Well, I would have thought I would have gotten almost every hand like that vote, but Newt Gingrich in that book, well, I'll have to tell you about it because I read it. He longs for the 1950s. He longs for an era that he is sure was better, and that the best of all Americas is part of a now gone and irretrievable past. But that misstates what America has really been like for 200 years. During the 19th century, there were truly alternative visions of the American future, pushing and shoving and wrestling with that self-reliance for a claim on the national imagination. The Second Great Awakening opened a time of tremendous religious upheaval in this country. Across the northern tier of New York was what was called the burnt-over district, so called because new religious movements fired up the locals and moved in waves across the area. Mormonism traces its roots to that northern tier of New York State. Utopian movements, communal, largely religious-based communities, started, acquired land, headed west, preached the idea of laying up your treasures in heaven and not worrying too much about personal property here on earth. We were in a society that watched tens of thousands pick up stakes on the eastern seaboard and head west. And in a society undergoing heavy immigrant flows, frequent imbalances in the number of men and women caused really wild kinds of community building. I mean, that old bourgeois father's knows best idea about how we all used to live turns out to be false once you look just beyond Robert Young back to the years before World War I. There were, for instance, permanently single women. Large numbers of permanently single women, and being permanently single did not call into question your sexuality or your usefulness to society. There was a large pool of lifelong single men in railroad crews, in seaports, in mining camps, and prairie farms. There was a socially acceptable life outside the family that had meaning, that had context, that was an honorable state of life. And today, we want to tell ourselves that America has always been this place of a lifelong married couple and an acceptable number of children. And it just isn't so. The city is a place where, like water, you can find your own level. People have told me that I'm over-sentimentalizing the city because I don't want to acknowledge that it's a place where you can be lonely too. Well, of course, I'm not silly. I realize that, you know, you can either be up in your neighbors' lives up to your chin, or you can live right below them for 5 years and not even know their first names. Of course that's possible. But the city provides, in its very design, in its DNA, the possibilities for a wide range on the social continuum of lives that you choose. Instead of having to defeat your environment in order to live in community, you can do it organically. So, you know, I guess what can I say to people in Portland? You know, it's much more clear what I say to people in St. Louis. And I've been there 3 times in the last 2 months, and they're like those flagellant religious orders. They just, you know, want me to keep dishing it out. I'm not auditioning for the role of national scold or anything. I just want us to remember that when we look back at what happened in this country in the last 50 years, the answer is not that the suburbs shouldn't have happened. I'd have to be an idiot to write that. We've doubled in size as a population. We've shifted away from our concentration in the northeast quadrant of the country to live in large numbers in all parts of the country. We've doubled in our household income in the generation after World War II. Obviously, things were going to change. My only point, you can boil down the 264 pages to one basic idea. It didn't have to happen the way that it did. And we have to be smart about what happened and why it happened in order, in places like this, where you've still got a future ahead of you to plan, that you're not going to do the same dumb things that they did in Brooklyn, that they did in Philadelphia, that they did in Chicago. You've got a chance and a choice to not do those same dumb things, and I just hope that you do better than they did. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Ray. My wife teaches in an elementary school in a part of Portland that was on the suburban edge 40 years ago, and where now over 12 languages are spoken each day by the children who attend that school. Our city is undergoing racial and cultural change at the moment. There's always change about us, but we're seeing a lot of change and diversity in our population that we haven't experienced, at least in some parts of the city, before. There are in this room, and I suspect in the audience that's watching or listening, a lot of earnest, good-hearted people who want to see us accommodate that change in a healthy way, just as we've tried to accommodate the physical growth of our city in a healthy way. You, in working on your book, talked to a lot of people of goodwill in neighborhoods all over the country that struggled and failed in many cases in dealing with those changes. What advice do you have for citizens who want to be constructive, good-hearted neighbors at a time of racial and ethnic change?
Well, the places where racial and ethnic change have damaged the social and physical landscape the most are places where it happened too quickly because people panicked. The neighborhood where I grew up was, for all the time that I was growing up, 95% or so white. Today, it's not. But the change happened over a period of 20 years and happened in a way so that nobody thought they were going to end up owning a house that was worth nothing when the change that was happening was done happening. In those places where it ended up being a wrecking ball, that kind of change encouraged people to indulge the worst ideas about how neighborhood life goes. They could only believe that there was one end to the story, that in fact you would move from one brand of hypersegregation to another brand of resegregation at the end of the story. That doesn't have to be the end of the story. And it's only people's faith that the value of their homes, that the value of their institutions give you on deposit something that's worth hanging on to that will get people not to run for the exits. Because it's when they run for the exits that chaos comes. Public schools are a particularly tense place when you have this conversation because they tend to overstate by a factor of 2 to 1 the presence of minority families in the community. For a couple of reasons. Because as a cohort, minority families tend to be younger, more heavily concentrated in their childbearing years, and on average have more children, and tend to use the public schools more heavily. All those inputs end up with a city that may have 20% black and Latino and Asian population and have schools that are nearly half non-white. This becomes an accelerator pedal for urban change, for people abandoning the city. But I'll tell you, there's a very interesting place out on the development edge of Chicago. It used to be all cornfields, and now it's a fully fledged bedroom community called Matson, Illinois. And Matson moved from being all white to 12% black. And when you talked to white homeowners in Matson about what was happening to their town, they all reported, not with rancor or emotion or anything like that, just reported as if it was local intelligence traded from house to house, that the schools were in decline, that their real estate values were going to or already declining, and that the crime rate was rising. In fact, in the years during which, from 1980 to 1990, when Matson moved from being all white to 12% black, standardized test scores in the schools had gone up, housing starts and housing values had gone up, and the crime rate had gone down. What does this disjuncture tell you about the sort of detritus of some of the ugliest times in our lives that we're still carrying around with us? That default assumption that This kind of change means declining housing prices, means declining schools, means rising crime. That chain has to be broken, or else we're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Just hold your water. Don't panic. It can work. Portland is one of those places. You know, all the large cities that have rapidly expanding populations are all significantly majority white cities. There are no either white plurality or white bare majority cities that are growing quickly in population. That should tell you something, too, about the affirmative choices that people are making when they choose urban life. They say, I want to live in a city, but I want to really live in a safe city. So where am I going to move? You know, since we're all sort of anonymous here, and I don't know any of you personally, or hardly any of you, I can say that without you feeling insulted, I hope. I mean, part of that's not a coincidence. It can't be a coincidence that when you look at all the largest cities in the country, the only ones that have rapidly expanding populations are white majority cities. There's something that has to do with the dynamic of where Fortune 500 front office spending goes. It has to do with where people decide to set up businesses. It has to do with people who feel that they want to leave the city that they've been living in and choose to go somewhere else. Well, people are going to come to the Pacific Northwest for a while. We'll see how long that lasts. Yes.
Hi, Ray. Chris Smith, club member. What I really wonder is, since you're here, who's doing the show right now? But seriously...
Friday. Ira Flater.
Science Friday, of course.
I get dumb on Friday. So
you said that Portland is well positioned to enter the next century, but if you look at some recent trends, I can almost wonder if the vision isn't under siege. We have a legislature that's attempting to dismantle the land use system. There was an aborted attempt to uncharter our regional government. The last bond measure to expand the light rail system failed. We're having trouble funding our schools. Are we at risk? Do you have any thoughts on that and how to perhaps recapture the vision and keep the momentum?
Well, you know, we were losing the seawar to Japan until 1943, so I wouldn't worry too much about some of that stuff. And notice you said an abortive attempt to dismantle the regional government. It didn't work. And legislatures can be thrown out of office, right? I mean, which is, let me be very, very clear. I want to be very, very abundantly clear that I am not advocating throwing anybody out of office. My only point was that we already have very efficient term limits in this country. They're called votes. And that's the only point I was trying to make. You don't know how some of these things come back to bite you. I really don't worry too much about that stuff. That's deciding in the fifth inning that the game is over. Don't worry.
Ray Polani, one of the City Club members, you talked to us about what was lost in the pursuit of suburban homes, highways, and the alienating automobile. That's what we said here in the bulletin. I look upon the automobile as one of the technical excommunicators, I call them. And I wonder whether it's love, as everybody keeps saying. We love our automobiles. I submit that it is instead the profound lack of transportation alternatives that caused us. So in that context, if I may say so, it's the money that dictates. And my question to you is, how can we switch the money to alternative transportation, transit primarily? Because if we want to end up someplace else, we better start spending our money on something else.
Well, I think in the short term, you can't beat the auto. I hate to be the wet blanket, but the auto wins every single argument. We never have a real, honest discussion about the real social and economic cost of the automobile because we're so blinded to it. We're so used to its presence that it gets factored into every decision that we make. just a couple of blocks away from here. I understand it's being redeveloped, but there's a Safeway that is well back in the lot, and of course it has this beautiful front lawn of automobiles. When that was being built in the first place, why didn't they put the cars in the back and put the Safeway in the front, so that if by chance, let's say you were just feeling a little crazy and you wanted to walk in and buy a packet of individually wrapped American cheese slices, you could walk in the front door without dodging moving automobiles. Some of this stuff is just heedless. It's just sort of rock coming down a hill sort of thinking. We're doing it because, that's the way we always do it. And we never consider other alternatives. There are people, and I've spoken to them, who will tell you that going to big box retail, they like it because it is more efficient, and say sometimes I have to park a block and a half away from the store I want to go to when I shop downtown. So, let's say you get a space in the back of the lot, and you can see in the distance, just before the horizon curves, the front door of Target, and you have to pack water to be able to make the trip. That reads to people, they will tell you that it was convenient because there's always parking. Whereas circling the block once, oh my God, circling the block once and then having to walk a block is inconvenient. I once ran around, one thing that automobiles do is totally destroy street-level life. And especially in those places where the blocks lead up to an expressway entrance. And in Washington, there's 5 blocks of backup from the expressway entrance to my office at 5 o'clock. So I grabbed an engineer and I ran around in the traffic with the engineer, frantically motioning for people to turn down their roll down their windows. And first of all, the sight of a man in a suit and a woman with a huge boom microphone at 5 o'clock just threw some of them off anyway. Maybe they hadn't seen a pedestrian all year. But I got some of them to roll down their windows, and I said, what could I do? If I was all powerful, what could I do to get you out of your car? And half of them said, nothing. Nothing. There's nothing you could do to get me out of my car. And when you looked in there, you understood why. It was a combination of their desk, their couch, their kitchen. They had a drink set up, Q-tips, tissues, atomizer. It was unbelievable. It was like the cockpit of a plane done by Martha Stewart. Why would anyone want to come from out there? The problem is we can't, until we start talking seriously about the real cost of automobiles and comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges when we talk about different ways of getting around, we're never, ever going to defeat the automobile in any argument. And when we do defeat it, it's only a holding action. It's like you know, telling somebody, well, put all your fingers and all your toes in the dike and we'll come back later. I think I'm getting the hook. But,
we got time for one more question.
Laura from Portland, Ray. Ray, I discovered you in Talk of the Nation in January '98 while I was making a trip to Boston after just having moved out of Denver while I was living in Iowa City and shortly before moving ultimately here to Portland. And all of this time, you and your show have been my personal portable community. So I want to thank you for the nourishment and for the companionship. And my question is, isn't CC Motupe Fatupe just the funnest name to get to say every day?
If I didn't have to say Setsuko Sato and Rina Okada, too, all in a row, it might be easier. But it's a very interesting looking office. I can tell you that.
Thanks very much.
And I'm at Powell's tonight. You've heard of Powell's, right? I'm at Powell's tonight. See you.
Thanks very much. We're adjourned. See you next week.